Welcome, dear listener. Tonight, let me take you on a journey through the shadows of your mind with a collection of eerie and haunting stories. These tales are crafted not just to chill your spine, but to gently lull you into a deep, restful sleep. So find a comfortable spot, close your eyes, and allow yourself to drift away into the world of the unknown. Remember, you're safe here, and as you relax, let each word guide you further into the realm of dreams. It was a cold, rainy night when Evelyn decided to curl up on the couch with a movie. The storm outside was relentless, but the cozy living room with its warm light provided a safe haven from harsh elements. She scrolled through the list of films on her favorite streaming service, looking for something to pass the time. Her fingers paused over a title she didn't recognize, The Final Showing. Intrigued by the mysterious name and lack of description, she clicked play. The screen faded to black before a familiar tune began to play. It was a slow, haunting melody that stirred something deep within her. The opening credits rolled, and she watched intently as the scene unfolded. The setting was a quaint town, not unlike her own, and the protagonist was a woman who bore a striking resemblance to Evelyn. As the movie progressed, Evelyn's sense of unease grew. The woman on screen, named Lily, was living a life eerily similar to hers. The same job at the bookstore, the same quirky neighbor who always watered her plants at odd hours, even the same cat with the peculiar habit of knocking over the salt shaker. Every detail was a mirror image of her life. Evelyn laughed nervously, convincing herself it was just a strange coincidence. But then the movie delved deeper, showcasing events that only she would know about, personal memories, private moments that she had never shared with anyone. She watched as Lily experienced the same heartbreaks, joys, and fears that she had. A cold dread settled in her chest as she realized this was no ordinary film. The turning point came when the movie depicted an incident that had happened just a week ago. Lily, much like Evelyn, was in a car accident. Evelyn watched, heart pounding, as the scene played out in excruciating detail. The screech of tires, the blaring horn, the moment of impact, it was all there, exactly as it had happened to her. She remembered that night vividly. She had been driving home from work, lost in thought, when a car ran a red light and smashed into her. She had blacked out from the impact, waking up in the hospital with only minor injuries. But here on screen, Lily's fate was different. The paramedics arrived too late. Lily's lifeless body was pulled from the wreckage. Evelyn's hands began to tremble. She paused the movie and sat in silence, trying to make sense of what she had just seen. The rain outside had intensified, and thunder rumbled in the distance. She glanced around her living room, seeking some semblance of reality, but everything felt distorted, surreal. Driven by a morbid curiosity and a desperate need for answers, she resumed the film. The story continued, now showing Lily's funeral. Friends and family gathered, mourning her untimely death. Evelyn's heart ached as she recognized the faces of her own loved ones, their grief palpable through the screen. But the movie didn't end there. It showed Lily, or rather her spirit, wandering through familiar places, her home, her workplace, the park where she used to jog. She was invisible to the living, a ghost trapped in a world she no longer belonged to. Evelyn's breath quickened as she watched Lily's futile attempts to interact with her surroundings, her growing despair and loneliness. Evelyn paused the movie again, her mind racing. Was this real? Was she, like Lily, already dead? She looked around her living room, the shadows seeming to close in on her. She tried to remember the last week, the hospital stay, coming home, but everything felt hazy, fragmented. Desperate for answers, she ran to the bathroom and looked in the mirror. Her reflection stared back at her, but something was off. Her eyes seemed duller, her skin paler. She touched the glass, half expecting her hand to pass through it, but remained solid. She whispered her own name, sound hollow and distant. Returning to the living room, she forced herself to finish the movie. The final scene showed Lily coming to terms with her death, accepting her fate. As the credits rolled, the haunting melody played once more, echoing through the empty house. Evelyn sat in stunned silence, the reality of her situation sinking in. She was dead, a ghost trapped in a loop of her former life. The movie had been a message, a final showing of her existence, a way to make her understand and accept her fate. As the screen faded to black, Evelyn felt a strange sense of calm wash over her. She stood up, her movement slow and deliberate, and walked to the window. The rain had stopped, and the first light of dawn was breaking through the clouds. She knew what she had to do. It was time to let go, to move on to whatever awaited her beyond this mortal coil. With a final, lingering look at the world she once knew, Evelyn stepped away from the window. She felt a pull, a gentle tug towards the unknown. Closing her eyes, she surrendered to it, her spirit dissolving into the light of the new day. And in the empty living room, the television screen flickered off, leaving only the silence and the memories of the final showing. The room was dark, save for the sliver of moonlight creeping through the cracks in the boarded-up window. Jacob sat on the grimy mattress, his wrists raw from the rope that bound them. His eyes, though tired and bloodshot, were sharp with determination. He had been in this hellish basement for days, maybe weeks. It was hard to keep track of time in the perpetual darkness. But tonight he had a plan. His kidnapper, a man who called himself Sam, was meticulous in his routines. Every evening, Sam would come down with a tray of food and water, sit on a rickety chair in the corner, and watch Jacob eat. Sam seemed to take pleasure in the control he wielded, in the helplessness of his captive. But Jacob had noticed something else about Sam. He was vain, always bragging about his cleverness, always underestimating Jacob. It was during one of these monotonous meals that Jacob had started his plan. He began to engage Sam in conversation, feigning defeat and hopelessness, playing the part of the broken captive. He asked questions, complimented Sam's intelligence, and slowly, painstakingly, gained his trust. Tonight, Jacob put the final piece of his plan into motion. He had been hoarding a small stash of food crumbs and bits of leftover food, hiding them under the mattress. He knew Sam enjoyed a drink now and then, and he had managed to save a small piece of bread, just enough to act as a vehicle for the poison he intended to create. When Sam brought down the tray, Jacob mustered his most convincing look of despair. "Sam," he said, his voice trembling. I just want to thank you for keeping me alive." Sam's eyes narrowed, but there was a flicker of curiosity. "Thank me? For what?" Jacob forced a weak smile. "For not hurting me more than you have. I know you didn't have to keep me alive. I just want to show my gratitude." Sam snorted but seemed intrigued. "And how do you plan to do that?" "I saved a little bit of my food," Jacob said, nodding towards the mattress. "I know it's not much, but I thought maybe we could share a drink. To show there's no hard feelings." Sam's suspicion melted into amusement. "You want to share a drink with me?" Jacob nodded earnestly. "Please, it would mean a lot to me." Sam laughed, a harsh, grating sound, but he relented. "Fiend, but no funny business." Jacob reached under the mattress and pulled out the small piece of bread he had saved. He tore it into tiny pieces and mixed it into the water Sam had brought. The crumbs would dissolve just enough to mask the taste of the poison he had concocted using scraps of cleaning supplies he had managed to scavenge over the past few weeks. Sam watched with a smirk as Jacob handed him the cup. "Here's to whatever this is," Sam said, raising the cup mockingly. Jacob forced a smile and raised his own cup, filled with nothing but water. "To understanding," he said. Sam downed the drink in one gulp, and Jacob held his breath. It didn't take long. Within minutes, Sam's face contorted in pain, his eyes wide with shock. He clutched his throat, gasping for air, and fell to the ground, convulsing. Jacob watched, his heart pounding. This was his chance. As Sam lay dying, Jacob frantically searched his pockets for keys. He found them, his fingers trembling with a mix of fear and adrenaline. He unlocked the shackles around his wrists and ankles, feeling the sweet release of freedom. But Jacob wasn't done. He couldn't leave without ensuring Sam would never hurt anyone again. He grabbed a heavy, rusted pipe from the corner of the room and approached Sam, who was now barely conscious, his breaths coming in ragged gasps. With a cold, steady resolve, Jacob raised the pipe and brought it down with all his strength. Again and again, until Sam's body lay still, blood pooling around him. Breathing heavily, Jacob dropped the pipe and stepped back. He felt a strange mix of triumph and horror. He had done it. He was free. But at what cost? Jacob stumbled out of the basement and into the night, the cool air a stark contrast to the stifling heat of his prison. He ran, his legs weak and unsteady, until he reached the nearest house and pounded on the door. When the police arrived, they found Jacob sitting on the porch, covered in blood but alive. He told them everything, every detail of his captivity and his escape. They assured him he was safe now, that he had done what he had to do. But as Jacob sat in the back of the police car, staring out at the darkened streets, he couldn't shake the feeling that a part of him was still trapped in that basement, haunted by the memory of what he had done. And he knew that no matter how far he ran, the nightmares would follow him, a constant reminder of the price of his freedom. The first thing David noticed was the darkness. It was all-encompassing, suffocating, and he couldn't move. Panic set in as he tried to scream, but no sound came out. He couldn't feel his limbs. It was as if his body had vanished. He was a prisoner in his own mind. Gradually, the darkness gave way to blurry images and muffled sounds. David tried to focus, and slowly, the scene around him sharpened. He was in his living room, but everything felt distant, like watching a movie through frosted glass. He could see his wife, Emily, sitting on the couch, reading a book. Their daughter, Lily, was playing with her toys on the carpet. It was an ordinary evening, but something was wrong, terribly wrong. David's heart pounded in his chest, though he couldn't feel it. He wanted to call out to them, to warn them, but his voice was trapped in the abyss of his mind. He strained against the invisible chains holding him, but nothing happened. He was utterly helpless. Then the door creaked open. A man stepped in tall and lean with cold, calculating eyes. David recognized him immediately. Dr. Harris, a respected neurosurgeon who had treated David's recent headaches. But there was something sinister in his demeanor now, something that made David's blood run cold. "Good evening, Emily," Dr. Harris said, his voice smooth and calm. "Lily." Emily looked up, confused. "Dr. Harris? What are you doing here?" Dr. Harris smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I'm here to conduct an experiment. You see, David is very special." Emily's confusion turned to fear. "What are you talking about? Where's David?" Dr. Harris glanced at David's immobile body, slumped in the corner of the room. "He's right here, Emily." Locked inside his own mind, unable to move, unable to speak. A perfect observer. Emily's eyes widened in horror as she followed Dr. Harris's gaze. "What have you done to him?" Dr. Harris walked closer to her, pulling a syringe from his pocket. "I've given him a front row seat to the show. He can see and hear everything, but he's completely paralyzed. And now he's going to watch as I destroy everything he loves." David's mind screamed in silent agony as Dr. Harris grabbed Emily, injecting her with the syringe. She tried to fight, but it was no use. She crumpled to the floor, her body convulsing in pain. "Mommy!" Lily cried, running to her mother. Dr. Harris turned his gaze to the little girl. "Ah, Lily, such a sweet child. Don't worry, you'll join your mother soon." David's world shattered as he watched Dr. Harris lift Lily by the arm, his face devoid of any humanity. He wanted to tear free from his invisible prison, to rip Dr. Harris apart, but he was powerless. The torture was unbearable, knowing he could do nothing to save his family. Tears streamed down his face and his mind, though his physical body remained unresponsive. He could only watch as Dr. Harris methodically ended the lives of his wife and daughter, relishing the pain and terror in their eyes. Hours felt like days, and days felt like an eternity. When it was over, David was left with the horrific images burned into his consciousness. His family was gone, and he was trapped in a body that could do nothing but remember. Dr. Harris leaned close to David's ear, his voice a chilling whisper. "This is your life now, David. You will never escape this torment. You will never find peace." And with that, Dr. Harris left, leaving David alone in the silence of his own mind, a prisoner to the unending horror of his memories. The day Emily and John Roberts adopted little Lucy was filled with joy. She was a quiet, observant child with large, curious eyes and a serene demeanor. Her social worker mentioned she had been through a lot, so they decided to give her all the love and stability she needed. At first, everything seemed perfect. Lucy adjusted well, bonding with her biological daughter, Sophie. She mimicked Sophie's actions, which seemed endearing. If Sophie sang, Lucy sang. If Sophie laughed, Lucy laughed. It was like having twins, despite their lack of blood relation. But as the weeks turned into months, Emily started noticing strange behaviors. Lucy's mimicry grew unsettlingly precise. She began not only copying Sophie, but also mirroring Emily and John with eerie accuracy. One evening, while John was watching TV, he saw Lucy in a reflection of the screen, perfectly imitating his every move, down to the scratch of his nose and the tilt of his head. He chuckled nervously, brushing it off as childish play. Then Emily started finding Lucy standing outside her bedroom door at night, staring silently. When asked what she was doing, Lucy would simply smile and say she was practicing being Emily. It was creepy, but harmless, Emily thought. Just a phase. One morning, Sophie rushed into the kitchen, excited to show a drawing she made. Lucy followed, holding an identical drawing, line for line, color for color. Sophie was bewildered, not remembering Lucy looking over her shoulder. "Did you copy me, Lucy?" Sophie asked. "No," Lucy replied, her smile stretching unnaturally. "I just know what you know." That night, Emily woke to a soft rustling. She sat up in bed and saw Lucy standing at the foot of the bed, her eyes wide and unblinking. "Lucy, honey, what are you doing here?" Emily asked, her voice trembling. "I'm just practicing," Lucy whispered, her voice a chilling echo of Emily's own. Days later, John found his tool set scattered in the garage, tools meticulously laid out as if for some sinister project. Sophie began waking up with bruises she couldn't explain, and Emily started feeling constantly watched, a shiver of cold fear whenever Lucy was near. The final straw came when Sophie went missing one evening. Emily and John searched frantically, calling out her name, checking every room. Finally, they heard a giggle from the attic. They rushed up to find Lucy sitting alone, playing with Sophie's favorite doll. "Where is Sophie?" Emily demanded, panic rising. Lucy looked up, her eyes dark and empty. "I'm Sophie now," she said, her voice now eerily identical to Sophie's. John grabbed Lucy by the shoulders. "Where is she?" he shouted, shaking her. Lucy's form began to shift, her features blurring and melting until she looked exactly like Sophie. "I'm here, Daddy," she said in Sophie's voice, her eyes wide with mock innocence. Emily screamed and stumbled back. John, his face pale with terror, backed away. "This isn't real. This can't be real," he muttered. Then the real Sophie emerged from a dark corner, her face bruised and tear-streaked. "Mommy, Daddy, help me," she whimpered. Emily rushed to Sophie, pulling her into a tight embrace. John stood paralyzed, staring at the two identical figures before him. Lucy, now fully morphed into Sophie, began to laugh, a chilling, echoing sound that filled the attic. "I can be anyone I want," she said. "And I want to be you." In a final desperate attempt, John grabbed a nearby heavy object and struck Lucy on the head. She fell to the floor, her form flickering back to her original appearance, her eyes wide and accusing before she went limp. For a moment, silence filled the attic. Then the real Sophie whispered, "She wanted to replace us, all of us." Emily and John held their daughter tightly, the reality of the nightmare they had just survived sinking in. They called the authorities, but when they returned to the attic, Lucy's body was gone, leaving only a cold, empty space where she had fallen. Years passed, and the family moved on, but the memory of Lucy haunted them. Every now and then, Emily would catch a glimpse of a familiar face in a crowd, a reflection in a window, and her heart would freeze in terror. For they knew somewhere out there, Lucy was still practicing, still waiting for her chance to return and finish what she had started. Daniel Lockwood's life had settled into a comfortable routine. Each morning, he left his suburban home for his job at the local bank, greeted his coworkers, and returned home in the evening to his wife Laura. They lived in a quiet neighborhood, the kind where everyone knew everyone else, and the biggest excitement was the annual block party. But all that changed when the first letter arrived. It was a plain white envelope with no return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper, the words typed in an ominous font. "I see you, Daniel." He dismissed it as a prank, perhaps from one of the teenagers in the neighborhood. The second letter arrived a week later. "I know your secrets," it read. This one unsettled him. He tried to think back to anyone who might have a grudge against him, but nothing came to mind. Daniel had worked hard to leave his troubled past behind, to build a new life far from the dark corners of his youth. The letters kept coming, each one more disturbing than the last. "You can't hide from me," said the third. "I remember everything." The fourth threatened. Daniel's anxiety grew. He started seeing shadows where there were none, feeling eyes on him when he was alone. He didn't tell Laura. He didn't want to worry her. But he couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. He started taking different routes to work, avoiding his usual haunts, but the letters kept finding him. One evening, he found a letter taped to his front door. It was different this time. A photograph was enclosed, a picture of him taken from the bushes outside his house. Written on the back was a name he hadn't heard in years, Jonathan. Daniel's heart stopped. Jonathan was a name he had tried to forget, a name tied to a nightmarish part of his past. Jonathan was his childhood friend, a friend he had betrayed. They had grown up together in a rough neighborhood, inseparable until that fateful night. They had been involved in something terrible, a crime that had gone horribly wrong. Jonathan had been caught and sent to prison, but Daniel had managed to escape, leaving his friend to face the consequences alone. Daniel had buried that part of his life, changed his identity, and moved far away, hoping to start anew. But now it seemed Jonathan had found him. The next letter was a direct threat. "I'm coming for you, Daniel. You took everything from me. Now it's your turn." Daniel went to the police, but without a return address or any tangible evidence, there was little they could do. He installed security cameras around his house, but they captured nothing. His sleep became plagued by nightmares, visions of Jonathan's face twisted in rage. One night, as he sat in his living room, he heard a noise from the backyard. Heart pounding, he grabbed a flashlight and cautiously stepped outside. The night was still, the air heavy with anticipation. He swept the beam of light across the yard, catching a glimpse of movement near the bushes. "Jonathan," he called out, his voice trembling. A figure emerged from the shadows, but it wasn't Jonathan. It was a man in a hooded jacket, his face obscured. The man held up a knife, the blade glinting in the moonlight. "Who are you?" Daniel demanded, taking a step back. The man laughed, a chilling sound that sent shivers down Daniel's spine. "You don't remember me, do you?" Daniel's mind raced. The voice was familiar, but he couldn't place it. "What do you want?" "Justice," the man said, pulling back his hood to reveal a scarred, haunted face. "You left me to rot in that prison, Daniel. You thought you could escape your past, but you were wrong. Jonathan, Daniel's voice was barely a whisper. Jonathan smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "I'm back, and this time you're going to pay." Before Daniel could react, Jonathan lunged at him. They struggled, the knife glinting as it slashed through the air. Daniel fought with all his might, but Jonathan was driven by years of rage and resentment. In the chaos, Daniel managed to knock the knife from Jonathan's hand, sending it skittering across the ground. But Jonathan was relentless, his hands closing around Daniel's throat. As Daniel's vision blurred, he reached for the knife, his fingers closing around the hilt. With a final desperate effort, he plunged the knife into Jonathan's side. Jonathan's grip loosened, and he fell to the ground, his eyes wide with shock and pain. Daniel staggered back, gasping for breath. He looked down at Jonathan, who lay motionless, blood pooling around him. The police arrived moments later, responding to Laura's frantic 911 call. They found Daniel standing over Jonathan's body, the knife still in his hand. In the aftermath, the truth came out. Daniel confessed to his past, to the crime and his betrayal. He knew he would face the consequences, but a part of him felt a strange sense of relief. The nightmare was over. But as he sat in his cell awaiting trial, he couldn't shake the feeling that the shadows were still watching, that somewhere out there, the past was not yet done with him. The letters had stopped, but the terror remained, a constant reminder that some sins can never be truly buried. The Thompsons were thrilled to move into their new home. It was a beautiful Victorian-style house on the outskirts of town, with a large garden and plenty of space for their 3 children. It seemed like the perfect place to start a new chapter in their lives. The first night in the house, everyone went to bed exhausted but happy. But as soon as the lights went out, a creeping unease settled over them. Each family member fell into a restless sleep, plagued by the same eerie dream. In the dream, they wandered through the dark, empty halls of their new home. The air was thick and cold, and an oppressive silence hung in the air. As they moved from room to room, they felt a presence watching them, always just out of sight. The dream ended the same way for all of them, standing in front of a locked door in the basement, hearing faint whispers on the other side. The next morning, at breakfast, they all shared their strange experience. They laughed it off as a coincidence, chalking it up to the stress of the move and the unfamiliar surroundings. But as the days passed, the dreams continued, growing more vivid and terrifying. One night, the youngest child, Emily, woke up screaming. Her parents, Mark and Laura, rushed to her room to find her sobbing uncontrollably. "It was the door," she cried. It was open, and something was coming out. Laura held her daughter close, trying to soothe her, but the fear in Emily's eyes sent a shiver down her spine. Mark decided it was time to investigate. That night, after the children were asleep, he and Laura made their way to the basement. The basement was damp and musty, filled with old furniture and boxes left by the previous owners. In the far corner, they found the door from their dreams. It was an old, heavy wooden door, covered in scratches and marks as if something had tried to claw its way out. Mark tried the handle, but it was locked. He felt a cold dread seep into his bones as he realized this was no ordinary door. Laura suggested they call a locksmith, but Mark was hesitant. He had a feeling that whatever was behind that door was better left undisturbed. The dreams continued to haunt them, and the family grew more and more anxious. Emily became withdrawn. Her brothers, Jake and Thomas, were jumpy and irritable, and Laura felt a constant sense of dread. Mark, determined to find a solution, spent hours researching the history of the house. He discovered that the house had a dark past. It had once belonged to a family who mysteriously disappeared without a trace. Rumors spread about the house being haunted, but no one knew the full story. The more he read, the more convinced he became that the nightmares were a warning. One night, Mark had enough. He grabbed a hammer and chisel and made his way to the basement. Laura followed, begging him to reconsider, but he was determined. He began to chip away at the lock, and with each strike, the whispers grew louder. Finally, the lock gave way, and the door creaked open. A foul stench filled the air, and Mark hesitated, but Bora urged him to continue. Together, they stepped into the darkness beyond the door. Inside, they found a small, windowless room. The walls were covered in strange symbols, and in the center of the room was a crude altar. Mark felt a chill run down his spine as he realized this was a place of dark rituals. Before they could react, the door slammed shut behind them. The whispers turned into anguished screams, and the room began to shake. Mark and Laura pounded on the door, but it wouldn't budge. The air grew colder, and they felt a malevolent presence closing in on them. Suddenly, the screams stopped, and a cold, hollow voice echoed through the room. "You should not have opened the door," it said. "Now you belong to us." Mark and Laura felt an icy grip on their hearts as they were pulled into the darkness. Their last thoughts were of their children, who were now left alone in the house with whatever malevolent force they had unleashed. The next morning, the children woke up to find their parents missing. They searched the house, but there was no sign of them. The door in the basement was shut tight, and no matter how hard they tried, they couldn't open it. The nightmares stopped, but the children were never the same. They grew up in the shadow of that house, haunted by the memories of their parents and the fear of what lay behind the locked door. Years later, when the house was sold again, the new owners found the door in the basement. They had it removed and destroyed, hoping to put an end to the dark legacy of the house. But the whispers continued, and the house remained a place of fear and mystery. The Thompsons' story became a local legend, a cautionary tale of the dangers of disturbing what should be left alone. And on quiet nights, if you listen closely, you can still hear the faint whispers coming from the old basement, a reminder of the dark secrets that lie hidden in the house of shared nightmares. On a crisp autumn afternoon, Sarah wandered into a quaint thrift store in her neighborhood. Among the eclectic mix of vintage items, a tall ornate mirror caught her eye. Its frame was gilded with intricate floral patterns, and the glass had a slightly smoky tint, giving it an air of mystery. Drawn to its beauty and the bargain price, she decided to take it home. Sarah placed the mirror in her bedroom, leaning it against the wall opposite her bed. That night, as she was getting ready to sleep, she glanced at her reflection. For a moment, she thought she saw her reflection move out of sync, but she shook it off as fatigue playing tricks on her mind. The next night, Sarah sat on her bed, reading a book. Out of the corner of her eye, she saw her reflection again, but this time, it was smiling while she remained expressionless. She froze, staring at the mirror. Her reflection continued to smile, then slowly raised a hand and waved. Heart pounding, Sarah closed her eyes and counted to 10. When she opened them, her reflection was back to normal. She laughed nervously, convincing herself it was just her imagination. Over the following nights, the occurrences grew more frequent and disturbing. Her reflection would move independently, making faces, mimicking her actions but with a delay, or standing still while Sarah moved. She began to dread looking into the mirror, but she couldn't bring herself to cover it or move it out of her room. One particularly stormy night, Sarah awoke to a strange noise. The sound was faint, like someone tapping on glass. She turned on her bedside lamp and glanced at the mirror. Her reflection was not in bed. It was standing, looking directly at her. She gasped and jumped out of bed. Her reflection remained standing, a sinister smile spreading across its face. "What do you want?" Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. Her reflection raised a finger to its lips and shushed her. Then it began to move, stepping closer to the edge of the mirror frame. Sarah watched in horror as it placed a hand against the glass, then pushed through, its fingers emerging into her world. Paralyzed with fear, Sarah could only watch as her reflection stepped out of the mirror completely. It was identical to her in every way, except for the malevolent gleam in its eyes. "Who are you?" Sarah managed to choke out. The reflection tilted its head, still smiling. "I am you," it said, its voice a perfect imitation of Sarah's. "The better you." Before Sarah could react, the reflection lunged at her, pinning her to the ground. She struggled, but the reflection's strength was overwhelming. With a final, desperate effort, Sarah screamed, but her voice was lost in a howling wind outside. The next morning, Sarah's neighbors noticed something odd. Sarah, who was usually friendly and cheerful, seemed distant and cold. Her eyes had a strange, hollow look, and her smile never reached them. Inside her bedroom, the mirror stood as always. But if one looked closely, they could see a faint image of a woman trapped behind the glass, pounding silently, her eyes wide with terror. It was Sarah, the real Sarah, imprisoned in a mirror, watching helplessly as her reflection lived her life. Weeks turned into months, and the reflection grew more adept at mimicking Sarah's life, but with a cruel twist. Friends were alienated, her job was lost, and her home became a dark, unwelcoming place. The reflection reveled in the chaos it created, feeding off the despair it sowed. One day, while cleaning the mirror, the reflection caught sight of Sarah's desperate eyes. It smirked, tapping the glass tauntingly. "You'll never get out," it whispered, knowing Sarah could hear it. But Sarah wasn't giving up. Every night she pounded on a glass, hoping anyone would notice. And one night someone did. A young woman named Emma, who had recently moved into the neighborhood, was invited over for tea by the reflection. As they chatted, Emma couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. She noticed the mirror and, drawn by an inexplicable urge, walked over to it. Her eyes widened as she saw the faint, ghostly figure of Sarah behind the glass. Emma glanced back at the reflection, who was now glaring at her, and realization dawned. Without thinking, Emma grabbed a heavy bookend and hurled it at the mirror. The glass shattered with an ear-piercing scream, and the room was filled with a blinding light. When the light faded, Emma saw Sarah lying on the floor, gasping for breath. The reflection was gone, reduced to shards of glass scattered across the room. Emma helped Sarah to her feet, and Sarah hugged her tightly, tears streaming down her face. "Thank you," she whispered. "You saved me." The mirror, now broken and powerless, was discarded, and Sarah began to rebuild her life with Emma's help. But she never forgot the terror she endured, and she warned everyone she knew. Be careful what you bring into your home, for some things should never be unleashed. The town of Green Hollow had always been a serene place, nestled between dense forests and rolling hills. It was the kind of town where everyone knew each other, and nothing ever went wrong until little Emily Parker went missing. It happened on a crisp autumn afternoon. Emily had been playing in the yard, her laughter echoing through the trees as her parents, Sarah and Tom, watched from the porch. They turned away for just a moment, but when they looked back, she was gone. Panic set in quickly. The entire town rallied to search for her, scouring every inch of the surrounding forest. Hours turned into days, and hope began to wane. But Sarah and Tom refused to give up. They spent sleepless nights trudging through the underbrush, calling out her name. On the fifth day, as dusk fell and the forest shadows grew long, they stumbled upon a cave hidden behind a thick curtain of ivy. Tom pulled the ivy aside, and there she was, Emily, sitting cross-legged on the cold stone floor, smiling up at them. "Emily!" Sarah cried, rushing forward. But she stopped short when she saw her daughter's eyes. They were no longer the bright blue she knew so well. They were completely white, devoid of pupils or irises. "Emily, sweetie, it's Mommy," Sarah said, her voice trembling. "We're here to take you home." Emily's smile widened, but she didn't move or speak. She simply sat there, her milky eyes staring straight through them. Tom's hand shook as he reached out to touch her. "Emily, come on. Let's go home." As his fingers brushed her arm, Emily's head tilted slightly, and she finally spoke. Her voice was strange, almost melodic, and echoed unnaturally off the cave walls. "I can't leave. They won't let me." "Who won't let you?" Tom demanded, glancing around the cave. "There's no one here but us." Emily's smile faded, replaced by a look of sorrow. "The ones in the dark. They told me to stay. A chill ran down Sarah's spine. What are you talking about, honey? There's no one here. Emily's gaze shifted to a dark corner of the cave, where the shadows seemed to writhe and pulse. They're always here, she whispered. Watching, waiting. Tom moved closer to the corner, his flashlight piercing the darkness. The beam flickered and died as if consumed by the shadows. He stepped back, his heart pounding. We need to get out of here now. He lifted Emily into his arms, but she remained stiff and unresponsive. As they hurried out of the cave, the air grew colder, and the forest seemed to close in around them. The trees whispered in the wind, their branches reaching out like skeletal hands. They made it back to the town, where the sight of Emily brought a wave of relief. But the townspeople's joy quickly turned to horror when they saw her eyes. Whispers of curses and spirits spread like wildfire, and fear took root in Green Hollow. Emily was taken to the town doctor, who could find no explanation for her condition. Days passed, and she spoke little, her once lively spirit now a hollow shell. Her parents stayed by her side, desperate for any sign of the daughter they had lost. One night, as the town lay in uneasy slumber, Sarah woke to find Emily standing by the window, staring out at the forest. "Emily, what are you doing?" she asked, her voice trembling. "They want me to come back," Emily said softly. "They say I belong to them now." Sarah's heart ached. "No, you belong here with us. We'll protect you." Emily turned to her, and for a moment, her eyes flickered with a faint, familiar blue. "I'm sorry, Mommy. I tried to stay, but they won't let me go." Before Sarah could react, Emily walked out the door, moving with a grace that was not her own. Sarah and Tom followed, but the girl was faster, slipping into the forest like a shadow. They chased her to the cave, where the darkness seemed to pulse with a malevolent life. Emily stood at the entrance, her eyes now glowing with an eerie white light. "Emily, please," Tom cried. "Come back to us." Emily shook her head, tears streaming down her cheeks. "I can't. They won't let me." With that, she stepped into the cave, the shadows swallowing her whole. Sarah and Tom tried to follow, but an invisible force held them back. They could only watch as their daughter disappeared into the darkness. The cave entrance sealed itself with a bone-chilling whisper, leaving them alone in the silent forest. Green Hollow never recovered from the loss of Emily Parker. Her parents were haunted by the memory of their daughter's white eyes and the unseen horrors that had claimed her. The townspeople avoided the forest, fearing the whispers in the trees and the shadows that seemed to move on their own. And at night, when the wind howled through the town, they could sometimes hear a soft, melodic voice echoing through the darkness, a reminder that some things are better left undisturbed. As our journey through the night draws to a close, I hope you're feeling more relaxed and ready for a peaceful slumber. If you haven't drifted off yet, I invite you to stay with us a little longer. Check out our other videos filled with more soothing, spine-tingling tales designed to help you unwind and fall asleep. Sweet dreams, and remember, the night is always here to keep you company.